As we get started, I'd like to announce that Belmont Village is celebrating 25 years of service and friendship. We operate 31 communities in 8 states and Mexico City. We are proud to say that Belmont Village was one of the first in the nation to fully vaccinate our residents and our workforce. Today, we have with us someone extremely innovative in their field. Patricia Will is the founder and CEO of Belmont Village Senior Living. She was recently inducted into the Texas Business Hall of Fame and into the Senior Housing Hall of Fame. It is my pleasure to introduce my hero, Patricia Will.
Back to you, Jackie. You know, it's hard to believe that it was nearly a year ago that I invited 2 amazing physicians and scientists to a webinar like this one to explain the vaccines that we're about to get emergency use authorization from the FDA to protect us against COVID-19. Now, almost a year later, only 58% of Americans are fully vaccinated. Boosters were recently approved for certain groups, and we're close to full approvals for children 5 and over. Until March of 2020, most people like me took the subject of immunity too much for granted. We took a battery of shots as small children, often all at the same time, and our parents were grateful for the terrible diseases and even deaths that vaccines spared us. By contrast, the subject of immunity against COVID-19 and other diseases has become a lightning rod in our society, creating controversy and a level of discord heretofore unseen in America. To decipher all of this and more, we have 2 of the leading experts in America who can speak on the subject of immunity itself, the vaccines that confer immunity, and why seniors are invariably a first priority to get both the vaccine and the boosters. They can also speak to much more, including the shift from our need to protect seniors to what it looks like now for children, which is a perfect segue to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Peter Hotez. Dr. Hotez is the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine and leads Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development. He's a world-leading authority in battling some of this century's most deadly diseases like Zika, Ebola, West Nile, malaria, and now COVID-19. Dr. Hotez's brilliance as a scientist is matched by his extraordinary service in vaccine diplomacy, having served under Presidents Obama and Trump. A terrific writer, his most recent work, How to Prevent the Next Pandemic, was published in March of this year. Throughout this pandemic, he's frequently appeared in the media. He's our hometown hero here in Houston. And with the incredible demands that are a constant for you, Dr. Hotez, it's truly a privilege to have you back with us today. So let me dive in with the most fundamental of questions. It may seem trivial to you, but I'd like to start with the subject of immunity itself. What constitutes immunity, and why in some instances do we need exposure to disease to trigger immunity?
Well, you know, our immune system is hardwired to respond to microbial pathogens, and it does this through what's called the innate immune system. Certain characteristics of parasites or organisms will start triggering the initial inflammatory response. Then we have something called the adaptive immune system that produces antibodies and T cells and B cells to give us long-lasting protection. And the advantage of vaccines, of course, is they have the ability in some ways to do both, with an emphasis on adaptive immunity. Unfortunately, it looks like in some cases the vaccine immunity is waning over time, and it's not too surprising because, for instance, with the Pfizer vaccine, we gave those first 2 doses just 3 weeks apart, and that was necessary to immunize older Americans, including those at Belmont Village and their care providers and hospital workers. But that's not the schedule you would use to give a long-lasting immune response. So if you look at what we do with our pediatric vaccines, we give a bunch of immunizations in a row as infants, and then we wait 6 months to a year and then boost. And that's what gives us the durable protection. Well, guess what? The mRNA vaccines are going by the same playbook, that the protection goes up for a while. As expected, it declined. And now with that boost, that third immunization, that's what gives you a 20-fold rise in our virus neutralizing antibodies to halt the replication of the virus, and makes it more durable, lasting for months or I think years. So I think once you get your third immunization, and there's no firm conclusion about this, and there's disagreement in the scientific community, I'm of the opinion that once you get that third immunization of either your Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, you'll be good for a while. There's a real possibility of that, unless you have underlying immune deficiencies or you're immunocompromised. And so that's, of course, why it's so important to get that third immunization. But the point is, these were always 3-dose vaccines. And I said as much since last January. I don't think that message really got out. So the need for a boost took people by surprise.
It certainly took people by surprise, and then the approval process for the boost was somewhat confusing as well. The other day at our office, where we were conducting the booster clinics, pharma arrived with every food group. So they arrived with J&J and Moderna and Pfizer boosters. Can you speak to us about the idea of mixing and matching? There are people walking around now who suggest that you're better off mixing and matching than taking the same one. And it would be really helpful to get clarity on that.
Well, let's see what my colleague thinks. I'm of the opinion that you'll do better if you complete what you started. In other words, I got 2 doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. I got my third immunization, and I selected the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine again. Why? Because the company is going to collect a lot more data on the long-term effectiveness and safety of the vaccine with what we call the homologous boost, meaning the same one, and it works really well, as opposed to what incentive would Pfizer have, for instance, for collecting information about the Moderna boost or the J&J boost? So with Pfizer, I've been saying you start with Pfizer, finish with Pfizer, and say with Moderna, if you started with 2 doses of Moderna, when eligible, get that new boost, which will be, unless you're immunocompromised, it'll be at a lower dose. And even J&J, I think the J&J vaccine is a good vaccine in 2 doses. With the J&J story, it's a little bit different. It's not so much that the immunity was declining; it stayed up the same. It's just that I always thought the J&J vaccine was a 2-dose vaccine, looking at the virus neutralizing antibodies and T cell responses in the phase 1 and 2 trials. I was surprised when it rolled out as a single dose vaccine. So in some ways, what's going on with J&J is not so much it's a booster, it's an autocorrection. But to add to the confusion, the head of CBER at the FDA advisory committee warned, don't call it a second 2-dose vaccine, call it a booster, which is the exact opposite of what it is. So that there is some confusion. I think the only time I'm recommending a switch is if you got the J&J, and well, first of all, if you don't have access to anything else, go ahead and get whatever you can, but that's not usually the case in the US. But with the J&J vaccine, if you're a woman of reproductive age and you're either on birth control or you're pregnant, you're at more risk of thrombotic events. And the J&J vaccine, one of the rare complications is cerebral thrombosis. So I got a couple of calls from colleagues who are pregnant and asking me, what should I do? And I've said, in that case, you might want to switch. But it's a soft call, because when you look at the actual incidence of thrombotic events from the second dose, it's quite a bit less than the first dose. And we don't know what the durability of protection is going to be if you switch to Moderna or Pfizer. But I would guess for most of the Belmont Village residents, probably overwhelmingly, they got the 2 mRNA vaccines. And I'm suggesting stick with what you started.
Well, that's very helpful. A number of us have family members, relatives, business associates who travel to the United States from overseas, and even some of us have occasion to go overseas ourselves. The world has many more vaccines right now than Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J. AstraZeneca, Sinovac, especially in Latin America, we see a lot of Sinovac and Sputnik. Is there a reason that the CDC only recognizes those vaccines that were made in America? And are these other vaccines, I mean, I hate to put it this way because I don't want to denigrate the great work that's gone into them, but are these vaccines any good?
Well, there's about, there's probably now at least a dozen vaccines out there now, and ours is about to be added to that. So we have a low-cost recombinant protein vaccine that we've made for global health that could be scaled up and produced for the world. It's being rolled out now in India. They're making 100 million doses a month, and also Indonesia and soon Bangladesh, and hopefully globally in time. I think there's variability. I think the AstraZeneca vaccine is similar to the J&J vaccine. They're both an adenovirus vectored vaccine. Although it looks like the immunity to the AstraZeneca vaccine is waning. And then the question is, what do you get boosted with? Because usually the problem with the adenovirus vectored vaccines like J&J or AstraZeneca is you ordinarily might not be able to get a third dose of it because you develop antibodies to the adenovirus vector, and it would interfere with its ability to take. So, in England right now, where you have both AstraZeneca and Pfizer, probably most people will get Pfizer at that point. The AstraZeneca vaccine is also being made in India, where it's known as Covishield, and now we're looking at our vaccine as a potential booster for that one. So that's one that's pretty common. The whole virus inactivated vaccines, whole inactivated virus vaccines from China, the most notable one is CoronaVac, and the one from Sinopharm. Those seem to have waning immunity and are not holding up all that well against the variants. So in that one, I would recommend probably if you get here, come back and get one of the other, either mRNA or J&J vaccines. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of data on those. Then there's Sputnik V, the adenovirus vectored vaccine. Again, we don't have a huge amount of data on, probably worth getting one of the US vaccines. And I get a lot of questions like this, especially from the oil and gas industry here in town, because we have, Exxon, Shell, you name it, or have a gazillion employees overseas where they have often only had access to Chinese vaccines or one of the others. And that makes sense to give them a booster with either the mRNA or J&J vaccine. The problem there, again, is just not a lot of published data or publicly available data. So you're kind of going on an educated guess, really, more than an informed decision.
So I'm sitting here, I have to tell you, fairly awestruck by the fact that you're not only the expert that you are, but that all the while your lab here has developed a vaccine that you just characterized as low cost, that can be a huge part of the solution. What makes this protein recombinant vaccine different, and how can you bring it in at low cost?
Well, it's an older technology similar to that made used to make the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine that's been around for 4 decades. And so it's made through a process known as microbial fermentation in yeast. And it's cheap because the yeast, it's almost like similar to the process for making beer. But instead of the yeast producing alcohol, they're actually genetically engineered to produce the vaccine. Same technology as hepatitis B vaccine that's been around forever. Great safety profile, so much so that it looks, I think it'll be really promising as a pediatric vaccine. A lot of parents have already vaccinated their kid against hepatitis B, so they'll understand that same technology pretty well, and I think it'll be widely accepted. So we're looking at our vaccine as a standalone vaccine, as a pediatric vaccine, and as a booster as well. one of the challenges is, we've had to raise about $6.9 million here locally from Texas Philanthropies and a couple of others. But we're not a huge organization. So we're trying to punch above our weight in conducting this sort of Texas style vaccine diplomacy with India, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. We'd love to have it made in the U.S. We think it would find a use. Right now, we don't have a U.S. partner. We're in discussions with one or more of the Latin American countries and even African countries as well, because we need 9 billion doses to vaccinate the Southern Hemisphere, and it's just not going to happen with the mRNA vaccines. You can't scale it up and make it at this point.
This is fascinating, and if ever sitting here in Texas, I could find a cause that would be worth sponsoring, in case anybody's listening out there, it's the idea of using this vaccine to vaccinate the world, because we've seen through all of this how porous the world really is. And
well, it's sort of a nice side story about Texas. As when you turn on the cable news networks, Texas is not always portrayed in the best light, and for a number of reasons. But so people look at me and say, "Why did you go to Texas?" Well, I went to Texas for the science and innovation, to be part of the Texas Medical Center and Texas Children's Hospital and Baylor College of Medicine. These are science powerhouses, but it's a side of Texas you tend not to hear about in the national press much.
Well, thank you for saying that. We certainly treasure it here. So you talked a little bit with respect to your vaccine about pediatric vaccines. I've got a 5-year-old granddaughter who, according to the FDA, as of last week, is eligible to be vaccinated, although the CDC hasn't quite spelled out how.
The Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices is meeting as we speak, and if all goes well, by 4 or 5 o'clock this afternoon Eastern time, it should be green lighted, and I'm guessing Dr. Walensky, the CDC director, will probably move pretty quickly. So who knows, maybe as early as tomorrow, it could be you could start vaccinating your child. Unfortunately, only about a third of the parents in the country have bought in yet to this, and this reflects both genuine concern, a lot of anti-vaccine aggression, also the fact that the COVID rates right now are going down, even though I think they'll go back up. So parents may not be feeling the same urgency that they ordinarily might have.
Well, I want to ask you a number of questions about that, respectful of the time limit and the fact that you want to hear what Walensky ultimately decides. The first is that I read that the dose for Pfizer anyway is just, for kids, is just going to be a third of the dose of everybody else. And I was sitting with a friend who's an adult who's my age, she's about 4'9". And she said, "Why does a kid get a third of the dose? I'm the size of a kid, I buy children's clothes, but as a 60-year-old woman, I'm getting the full thing." So I said, I have no idea, but I'm going to ask Dr. Hotez.
Well, vaccines, tend not to go in this same kind of dose response as the kinds of pills that you take every day. So sometimes you get paradoxical effects. Sometimes a lower dose will actually give you more of an immune response, especially as a boost. And there's this well-known concept in vaccinology called fractional dosing, where sometimes less is more in terms of an immune response. And I think the thinking is and it's all based on empiric evidence. So the phase 1 clinical trials looked at 10, 20, 30 micrograms, meaning the 30 micrograms, the adult dose, 20, and then 10. And they found that the young kids responded as well to the 10 microgram dose as the adults did the 30 micrograms. So if you could spare the dose, and potentially that may have the added benefit of reducing the frequency of myocarditis, which people are concerned about, although it's still a pretty rare phenomenon. The rate of myocarditis, which is the highest among young males, is still only 1 per 10,000, like 5 to 16 per 10,000. This is still pretty rare, but the thinking is also with the lower dose of mRNA, that rate might even go down even further.
So thank you for that. You just referenced a hesitancy that people have, even people who are vaccinated themselves, about getting their children vaccinated. I don't want to conflate the personal with the professional here, but it leads me to, a personal and professional question. A few years ago, you published a work, which, by the way, I highly recommend to our audience here today. The book is called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism. And the Rachel in the story is, of course, your now adult daughter, who was diagnosed with autism at a young age. Apart from being a great read, it goes to the core, in my view, of something that's really hard for me to understand. As the world continues to fight this deadly pandemic and so many others, what is it going to take for people to realize how important it is to give the gift of immunity, to take advantage of these vaccines? When does the case become crystal clear?
Well, the case, should be crystal clear by now. We have some terrible numbers. We've lost 90,000 to 100,000 Americans to COVID just over this summer into fall, all from the Delta variant, almost all unvaccinated, despite the availability of safe and effective vaccines. So these are 90 to 100,000 Americans whose lives were lost, that were needlessly lost. Almost all of them could have been saved had they been vaccinated. And, I don't even call it misinformation or disinformation anymore. I call it anti-science aggression. And it's coming from some of the non-governmental groups that are monetizing the internet. They're sometimes referred to as the disinformation dozen. It also includes some political aggression on the far right. If you watch some of the conservative news channels at night, they're going on anti-vaccine rants or telling you that ivermectin is just as good as vaccines, which it's not. And ivermectin doesn't work. Or you heard this from members of Congress that first they're going to force vaccines on you, then they're going to take away your guns and your Bibles. And as ridiculous as that sounds to us, there's a segment of the U.S. population that's bought into it and does not get vaccinated out of defiance. So how you yank the anti-science out of this has been one of the real struggles, and I've been writing and speaking about it, and it's probably going to be the subject of my next book but I haven't told Johns Hopkins University Press about it yet. But
well, I very much look forward to that one. I want to just ask you one more quick question, but how is it that as a hometown hero, you're about to be the Grand Marshal of our Thanksgiving Day parade here in Houston?
Well, that'll be a lot of fun, and I'm very grateful to the people of Houston and honored. It's a great honor. I was at an event over the weekend with Mayor Turner and Judge Hidalgo, and they're just wonderful people, and it's it's really interesting. As I say, Texas and Houston don't have great reputations back in the Northeast where I'm from, but from my standpoint, Houstonians are some of the most intellectually curious people I've ever met, and this has been a really exciting place to move and live. And we live in this the Montrose neighborhood where you can walk everywhere. And I became a writer when I came to Houston. And so the irony is I moved to Houston to become a writer and to not have to have a car all the time.
Yeah, that is an irony.
There's a lot of irony here.
Well, I promised you and Douglas that I would get you off the screen or the stage, as it were, by 3:30. We're hitting the mark, but I cannot, again, express enough that gratitude, not just for your appearance with us today and what you've shared, but also for everything you do every day.
Well, thank you very much. And it's great meeting you, Doctor, virtually anyway. And good luck to Belmont Village, and congratulations on everything you're doing.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hotez. Our presentation is not over, and you're in for yet another real treat as we bring back to the screen Dr. Carla Parasinato. As a provider of seniors housing and care, I'm especially aware of the scarcity of true experts in geriatric medicine. For that reason, we at Belmont Village are truly privileged to have had Dr. Carla Parasinato as a key advisor on best practices for the treatment of disease and for preventing infection in seniors. Dr. Parasinato, AKA Dr. Carla, is professor and leading clinician of geriatric medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. At UCSF, she manages inpatient and outpatient clinical programs, which really represent the gold standard for care for the elderly. She's one of the rare geriatricians who also holds a master's in public health from Johns Hopkins. She's a frequent public speaker and has authored or co-authored numerous publications. Apart from that, she's extraordinarily fun. In December of last year, as the first vaccines against COVID-19 received approval, Dr. Carla's advice was pivotal for our company, for our seniors, and for their families. Now, almost a year later, it's wonderful to have you back on the screen to speak with us about senior immunity in particular, and of course, the lessons learned during 21. So Dr. Carla, I want to start by asking you the following. When I turned 60, it felt like my internist started counting as many vaccines for me as I got when I was an infant. Recent examples include repeat vaccines for shingles and shingles for pneumonia. Why is it necessary, or at a minimum advisable, for seniors like me to get these vaccines at this stage of life?
Thanks, Patricia, and thanks so much for welcoming me here. I can't believe with the COVID warp that it's been a year, but I guess you're right about that. You know, I think that there's a couple things that we need to think about as we get older, in that just as the rest of our body changes with age, our immune system is no different. In fact, our immune system is even more complicated. As Dr. Hotez mentioned, we have our innate immunity and our adaptive immunity. And what we have learned is that, you know, our body is, you know, a repository of everything that has happened over our lifespan, both externally, so exogenously, and internally, so endogenously, and all that is manifest in our immune system. So what happens as we get older is that our immune system is not as precise as it is when we're younger or when we're in our middle years. And so our response to infections is just, you know, to put it blankly, it's kind of a mess. And so that means that we need this extra immunity to protect ourselves should we want to try to have an infection like younger people and survive it. So that's really what it is. We can go into more details, but it's really that our immune system is not as elegant as it was. In some ways, it's delayed and slow to respond, which I think is what's highlighted in COVID, and we can spend time on that. So it's not as elegant, it's delayed, but then when it takes an effect, it's an overdrive, which is why we get the severe COVID. So it's really complicated, actually.
We work very hard to, and we've worked with you for years on being sure that we get our seniors and our workforce vaccinated against influenza. It seems that flu is most dangerous for small children and for seniors, even before you get to COVID. Why is that?
I think it's a similar thing, is that just like in our younger age, but in our older age, our immune system is trying to figure out what's going on. And what happens, so there's, when we get exposed to a virus specifically, or a bacteria, there's a couple things that happen. It's our innate immune response, which is the unelegant part that says, hey, there's something weird and foreign in my body. Let me attack it. And then there's the adaptive immune response, which is, okay, this is something specific. How do I target the specific thing, which is how you develop antibodies. And so that's where our systems are going awry, both in older age and in our younger age. And so that is, again, why it can be so severe. So what happens as we get older is that when we get sick, our usual manifestations of illness are different because we have this like, there's something funky going on in my body, but I don't know exactly what it is. And so I'm just going to be maybe having less energy and whatever. But then our immune system really kicks in and goes into overdrive, and it has all this pro-inflammation. And already as we get older, we have this chronic sense of inflammation in our body. And that's why we get such an exaggerated response, which is why we get, when we get influenza, for example, we get multi-organ failure. We get severe respiratory failure because your body is in such a state of shock and massive inflammation that we just are trying our best to recover, but are not doing it elegantly.
So how does, for example, it's flu season, how does the flu vaccine guard against that?
Yeah. So what it tries to do is, what vaccines try to do is prime your adaptive immunity to recognize these viruses before they come in full force. So it's trying to get our own body to make antibodies, to make that protection to these infections, so that if we do get the virus, our body says, hey, I've already seen this. I can attack it a little bit more directly and be more specific, so that if we do get it, we don't get this massive response and end up critically ill. So this is why, there's a lot of lore out there about, oh, well, I still get sick. Yes, but you're not going to die from it. And that's what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to prevent you from going to the hospital, dying from it. And of course, there's the spread to others, but it's really trying to make this a more manageable illness.
So a couple of questions come to mind as you explain that. The first is what a senior actually gets. So when you're filling out the questionnaire for COVID-19 at the Walgreens pharmacy, everybody gets the same thing. But when you're filling out the questionnaire for the flu vaccine, they prompt you with, are you over 65? And if you're over 65, the pharmacist volunteers that you get something else. What is something else, and why do older people need a different vaccine? Yeah, so usually what people get is the higher dose. And again, I think this has to do with the same thing, that our immune system as we're getting older is uncoordinated and not as elegant as it once was. And so just like Dr. Hotez was mentioning, how do we figure out the doses needed for younger people? It's a similar thing for older adults. However, I will say, and I think I've said this before when I've done talks with you, we live in a very ageist country and world, and our knowledge of geroscience is very delayed. However, even with that in mind, we know that with things like the flu vaccine, we do need a higher dose or a higher amount to really generate the same immune response that younger people can generate. So that is why. That sort of explains, or the last couple of answers that you provided sort of explains why, after the immune compromised, seniors were placed next in line for boosters. We get asked this question all the time. For seniors in particular, why is taking the booster so important?
Oh my goodness. We saw very clearly, and we continue to see, thankfully, as Dr. Hotez mentioned also, each pharmaceutical company is tracking their data over time, as is the FDA, that we clearly see the linear decreases in antibody levels in our body, neutralizing antibodies. Neutral antibodies literally mean, okay, you have an antigen, which is the virus, and then you have the antibody, they meet, they cancel each other out. So therefore it's like the infection didn't exist. And if we have lower levels of antibodies, it means that we are not as adept at fighting the virus, and therefore we are at risk of getting more sick again. And what we've seen is that amount of antibody in our bodies is going down quicker than with other people. I think there's some interesting things moving on into the future. For example, Will we see different COVID vaccines for older adults or different doses? It's possible. I think we saw a real difference. There's some debate about this. In my review of the literature is that there was a true difference between the mRNA vaccines and the Johnson & Johnson. Hard to know at that time. And at some point it's like any vaccine is better than none. Although now we're understanding that there's some improvements with some versus others.
Are you worried at all about the next variant? People come to me all the time and say, well, Delta is only at the beginning of the Greek alphabet.
Mm-hmm.
And will these boosters be effective, do you think, or do we have to invent new ones?
It's going to be an evolving thing in the same way that every year we have to look at and predict what is our next combination of flu vaccines going to be. And so I think we need to start thinking about variants as a natural part of this disease process. What is our best protection to get more people vaccinated? Because ultimately, if there's less virus circulating in our world, we are better as a world of combating this, which is why Dr. Hotez's work in really promoting vaccines internationally is really fantastic. We live in a global world. If we only vaccinate the US and ignore the rest of the world, we're not going to be any better off. And so how do we really think about overall vaccine rates internationally so that we can all be protected and be prepared for the next variant? Thankfully, the vaccines we have on market right now are actually showing to be remarkably good towards Delta. And so, I think we're in an okay place right now.
So as a thought leader on immunity and protection, particularly for the elderly, there have to be a million lessons learned from the last 18 months on how we as a society, let's just start here in America, can better protect seniors from diseases like COVID-19. I guess in another way, I'm asking Dr. Carla, what did we miss and how can we do better next time?
Yeah. That is such a great question. And I think this really highlighted that we have a tendency to overlook seniors, and we have a tendency to say everyone over 60 is the same, everyone over 65 is the same. And what we've realized when we actually spend the money and resources on looking at older adults, there are differences. And I really actually working with you all very early in the pandemic, and you all were seeing these changes in your residents, and you were saying, I'm worried about these residents. I think they're sick, even though they're not meeting the strict criteria and they're not showing the traditional symptoms. They were actually. We just, as a country, failed to define what the symptoms are for older adults. But your own people at Belmont were saying, Mrs. Smith is not eating as well. She fell. She is weak. Those were signs of COVID, but we did not call it that. And that's where we went wrong. And this is where, when we think about what are traditional signs and symptoms of illness, there are the usual fever, cough, whatever, but there are things that come earlier. And it has to do really, again, with my explanation of what happens with our immune system. Our immune system as we get older is unelegant. So it is just saying, there's stuff going on in my body. I don't feel well. And that's what I'm showing the world. And it's only much later when the adaptive immunity kicks in and it's an overdrive that people get very sick, which is why we saw these people kind of lingering, not doing so great, and then get very, very sick. And we missed a window. And so our lessons as we go into the future for ourselves, for our family members, for our communities is let's pay attention to what we're seeing and let's be thoughtful about older adults are different and let's not continue to ignore them.
No, touche, underline. Thank you for that. I want to switch from vaccines to, for a second, to non-medical factors that may have an effect on the immune system. Sleep or lack of sleep, stress, nutrition. I know people who swear that laugh therapy is an antidote to, if not to infection, to inflammation. Can you talk about how it's possible that these non-medical interventions can have an effect on one's immunity?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's, immunity is complex. It's what comes in our genes. It's also epigenetics, which is how our genes interact with our environment and our behavioral interventions. Um, it is complicated, but the more I think we're learning about aging, and I will again say that we do not have enough money and resources put on research on aging, but we're getting there. Aging is made complex by chronic inflammation. We don't understand all of that. But then you think about what are these non-medical things happening? So let's take the area of loneliness, which is my area of research. So one of the biological mechanisms of loneliness is that the distress of loneliness is leading to heightened stress levels, heightened inflammation, and this is what's leading to all these health outcomes. It is no different with infections and with other things in aging. And so as we start to learn more about our bodies, the things that we do externally in our life, non-medically, to bring our stress levels down, to bring our chronic inflammation down, we think that is helpful. We're trying to learn more, but that's what it's about, which is why sleep is important. However, we also then have to be careful that because you sleep badly doesn't mean that you should then be on all these medications that are going to undo the positive things that you get without the medications, but why nutrition is also incredibly important.
So the subject of isolation is obviously one that is important in your research. You've written a lot about this and have studied it a lot. And it's particularly pointed during the last year and a half when so many seniors were trapped in isolation in their homes. Has there begun to be any measurement of the effects of that period, and especially on inflammation and immunity? Are we too soon to find out what that means?
I think we're too soon and too late to find out, in that we probably needed to study people long-term in real time and we missed our window. I think we all know that we saw people that died directly from isolation, but we weren't capturing that. And nor is there, as a physician, I can't write as a cause of death isolation, even though I think I probably should be allowed to do that. And so I think there's more to come here. But I think that, as we move forward and as we think about how do we mitigate all of this is ultimately about mitigating risk. So how do I protect myself? How do I protect my community? How do I protect the public good? All of those don't always have the same answers, which is what's really hard. I see a question in the chat about what do we do with the Thanksgiving holidays? And without getting into the specifics about that, there's no one right answer, because it's going to be dependent on each person. So is the resident at Belmont Village going to this Thanksgiving, gathering? Why is the one person still unvaccinated, and how do we keep them vaccinated or make sure that they're masked? And how do you balance the need for socialization, which I think is critically important with mitigating risk and with balancing risk? So can it be outside? Are the people that are not vaccinated masked? What is the period of exposure? So those are all the things that we need to continue to consider. But, Patricia, I wish we had more evidence on the direct effects of isolation, but we don't know them because we haven't been measuring and we haven't been asking the questions.
It's interesting because on the one hand, certainly in the popular press, those of us who house seniors in community took a beating for the fact that they were there. And at risk. And it struck me throughout, and still strikes me today, that being in community, even in apartment quarantine at times, but with plenty of interaction with staff, with, yes, contrived interaction with one another, could be Zoom with guys in the next room, but with somebody helping you to operate it, people were so much better off.
Yes.
Than to be by themselves at home. It's interesting that translates into actual real inflammation and infection.
Right.
We certainly see it with respect to cognitive decline.
Exactly.
Well, I want to allow you to get on an airplane and get back home to your 15-month-old. And I want to also allow time for Q&A for the audience. I guess the one lingering question that I have is we continue to have, even as the boosters have come out, not so much from our seniors. So far, our take rate in seniors is 95%, but more from the workforce. The same concerns as arose when the vaccines came out, although our workforce is fully vaccinated. Is it okay to take the booster if I'm trying to have a baby? Is it okay if I'm pregnant? Can you speak to those, because it's so relevant today in terms of ultimately getting protection?
Yes, I think it's very interesting that those concerns continue to be there, because the science is pretty clear on this, and I think that what the onus is on us as a scientific community to be very clear about where there is evidence and where there's not. But it is very safe to have these vaccines when we are pregnant. It is very safe to have them if we're breastfeeding. And I actually was more encouraged to get my third booster because I was still breastfeeding and thought, I'm a 15-month-old or 12-month-old at the time, and let me pass on this immunity to my child. And so there's a lot more evidence of benefit than there is of harm. And so it's going to be continued to advocate for the greater public good. And I think it's forcing us as a country to take a good look at ourselves in terms of what we prioritize. And I think especially working in the realm of service and healthcare, we owe it to our residents, frankly, to do this if we want to work in this industry.
Well, thank you for that. There's nobody better than everyone we have at the front line. I just want to help them address concerns where, there's so much in the news.
Yes.
So I am deeply appreciative of this audience today, and anything we can do at Belmont Village to bring you the best information from the smartest, I say guys in the room, guys and gals in the room, who are really at the forefront of the important research and practice that we need as a society and to be sure as a world. Dr. Carla, thank you. I will write my note to Peter Hotez as we find out what the CDC is doing about little kids this afternoon.
Yes.
And I thank the audience, and please feel free to reach out to us. We have recorded this session, so if anybody would like to see it again, we would be glad to share it with you. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to my colleague, Jackie Waldberger, for a close on this important session. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Jackie, you're on mute.
Hey there, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Perissinotto. Thank you, Patricia, for having this really important information delivered to our families, our residents. I can tell you, and just in hearing what you were saying about loneliness and isolation affecting immunity, I obviously am not a researcher, but I have been working with our families day in, day out for so many years. And I can tell you the effects of socialization on people that move in. It's not just the wonderful dining that we have and the food and the variety. It's eating together with new friends, with people, feeling cared about, feeling loved. I would say that most of the people that move into my community, sure, maybe there's some underlying need, but most of the time, our residents are moving in for an opportunity to have more social experiences. There's certainly a lot of programs and opportunities that we do every day to keep our residents happy. So with that, we have our family advisor that's always available to speak to you. She has a wealth of knowledge about Belmont Village. And if you would like to give her a call, please call her at the number above on my screen here. That number is 424-232-0701. Again, that number is 424-232-0701. Thank you everyone again for your time, for your attention. Can't thank you enough, Dr. Perissinotto, Patricia. Happy 25th anniversary at Belmont Village.
Thanks, Jackie. Take
Thank
care,
you, Ann.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.